have it. I'll post it on the CARB website, which I'll provide the link. The link is provided in the chat. Okay, so this is research seminar for the contract Barriers to Reducing the Carbon Footprint of Transportation. Thank you to everyone for joining this morning. I really appreciate it. So just real quick, the seminar, like I said, is recorded and it'll be posted online. Attendees are muted during the presentation. Please use the Q&A function to ask questions. And at the end, there will be open discussion following the presentation. Okay, so what does CARB research support? So CARB supports sustainable community research to help us combat climate change, meet air quality standards, create healthier homes and communities, advance equity in environmental and health outcomes. And here you'll find several resources for different solicitations that we're supporting for the upcoming fiscal year, as well as just research planning. I think I forgot to mention, my name's Nasim Golestani. I'm the contract manager for this particular contract. Okay, so the study context and motivation, there's several. One is Senate Bill 375, which the goal is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from land use and transportation. There's also the Clean Miles Standard, whose goal is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from transportation network companies and certain other types of transportation providers. There's also understanding the impact of the pandemic on the transportation sector and changes in individual behavior to identify strategies to reduce vehicle miles traveled, or VMT, as well as GHG emissions from the transportation sector. And hopefully results from this study can inform the implementation of the Clean Miles Standard and other supporting policies. So this contract was broken down into 3 tasks. The first was related to TNCs, such as Uber and Lyft. The second, which is the goal of this, or is the topic of this presentation. And then the third is coming up with policy recommendations for reducing VMT and greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector. So a quick background, the transportation sector accounts for almost 50% of GHG emissions in California when you're also accounting for fuel production. And light-duty vehicles make up 70% of the transportation sector's direct emissions. So the task 2 goal is to task 2, which is what we're going to be focusing on today. The goal is to understand the impact of the pandemic on the transportation sector and changes in individual behaviors to identify strategies to reduce VMT and GHG emissions. And the results will help achieve Senate Bill 375's goals. So the principal investigator for this project is Dr. Giovanni Circella. He's the director of the UC Davis 3 Revolutions Future Mobility Program. He's also UC Davis Honda Distinguished Scholar for New Mobility Studies. And he's also a professor of mobility in the Department of Geography at Ghent University. Yeah, so just real quick, the final reports can be found at this link, and I'll post this link in the chat again, and the seminar slides and recording will also be found there. So with that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Circella, and we really appreciate his time. So if you'd like to get started.
Thank you so much, Nassim, and good morning, everybody. It's great to have you all here with us today for this webinar. I will try not to take too much time with my presentation because I think the goal of today is to discuss some of the findings of our project, but also to leave time for question and answers. And so to discuss really some of our findings and the implications also they can have for the work that many of the participants that are now in the audience today might extract for their work. And so I think it's very important that we leave also time for question and answer. First of all, I want to acknowledge the fantastic group of colleagues at UC Davis that have been working with us in this research. As Nassim already mentioned, this is a project that starts with the support of CARB. It's part of a larger project, so the barriers to reducing the carbon footprint of transportation. As Nassim mentioned, we have three parts of this project. Today, we're really focusing on part 2. But I also would like to invite everybody to check the reports for the other 2 parts of this project. Part 1 was also done by our team at UC Davis. Part 3 was run and led by our colleague, Professor Susan Handy at UC Davis. The 3 parts together look at 3 different aspects of how to reduce the carbon footprint of transportation. So I really want to thank Nassim, Melanie, and all the colleagues at CARB, and in general, all the colleagues in the agencies in the state of California for their support of research that we do in the university that we hope can inform their policy making and that can lead to some positive impact also as we try to make transportation more sustainable and we work together for more equitable and sustainable transportation. So as I mentioned, I was not alone doing this work. We had many colleagues that contributed to this. I hope you can see my screen right now. So I want to give a big thank you to all the research team and all the colleagues that were working with us. First of all, the colleagues that are today also connected, Dr. Bashar Obziland, Dr. Siddhartha Gular, Dr. Patrick Loa, and then all the other colleagues. Dr. Yong-Sun Lee joined us during this project, but became very important in the development of the activities of this research. And then our fantastic graduate students. Without them, we couldn't do this work. So I want to mention in particular, Shatyan Yogansen, Keita Makino, Arojit Yena. All of them, they did a great contribution to this project, but also if you will see the acknowledgement in our report, there are many other colleagues at UC Davis and other institutions that really help in the development of this research. And so really, we want to thank all of them for their contribution. Now, let's look a little bit about the outline of what we're going to cover today in this presentation. I'm going to try to have a brief overview about our project background. We will talk about the data collection and processing, and then we will focus about some specific aspects about how the pandemic reshaped our society and some of the findings that we have created during this project that can be relevant for policymakers also. And so this includes impacts of the pandemic on remote and hybrid work, impacts of the pandemic on e-shopping and home delivery, impacts of the pandemic on travel behavior choices, and also the impacts of the pandemic to access to and use of private vehicles. We will then discuss some of the unique challenges and adjustments that low-income household members have been having during the pandemic, and then some key messages and policy implications. And I want to mention during this presentation that please feel free to raise your questions. So you can use the question and answer feature in Zoom. You can post your question, and then we will try to pick them up during the webinar. If there are clarification questions, Nassim, please feel free to stop me, and we can answer the question for clarification question. If there are more general questions, we can answer them in the question and answer time at the end of this presentation. So with that, I will dive a little bit into the project background. So this project is based on a large data collection effort that we've been running at UC Davis with multiple waves of data collection. We call it our post-COVID mobility study. Really, when we started this project, we could build on some rounds of data collection that were run before the pandemic, and then we developed new data collections during the pandemic. And then now we live in the post-pandemic society, so we have now new data collection that happened after the pandemic. And so somehow, of course, like, we were building in this project to some data collection that had nothing to do with the COVID-19 pandemic. So in 2018 and 2019, we collected the data in two different surveys that were administered in 2018 only in California. In 2019, we surveyed 8 major regions in the United States. And those were projects that were done, of course, at the time. We had no idea that a COVID big pandemic would happen soon. But somehow these data sets were very useful because we could actually use this data set as benchmark to compare our data during the pandemic. And also we had the ability to re-sample, re-recruit the same participants. So we could have actually the ability to see, like, how their behaviors have changed from resampling some of these participants. We developed 2 rounds of data collection in 2020. The first one was launched in 2020 spring, so in the very early phase of the pandemic. Then we had, like, the time in which we started working very closely with CARB and the other state agencies in California, and we did a larger data collection in fall 2020. And then we did another round of data collection in 2021. And then about 2 years later, we could add another round of data collection in fall 2023, which is the time actually that we really can call pretty much post-COVID, because it's really the time in which at this point, the pandemic emergency ended and we can refer to the new behaviors that are somehow getting, like, established in the post-pandemic time. So let's get a little bit, like, a little bit on the background of the project. So what do we know already about this project is that, of course, there's been a lot of research that has been done in this area. So if you look, like, for, like, data and information we already knew when starting this project, we knew already that before the pandemic, commuting averaged a large component of total VMT in the US. It was about 28% of the total VMT in the US, according to sources in the literature, with 88% of workers that were actually using a private vehicle during their commute. Well, a lot of work has been done during the pandemic, and then we have been seeing, like, that already other studies have been highlighted how commuting was decreasing very sharply during the pandemic, and there was a huge transition to in-person work and work from home during the COVID-19. So in our project, we also wanted to study, as the pandemic subsides, how these things have been evolving in the post-pandemic time. And so one of the big focus of this project was also to see, like, the evolution in the post-pandemic time after the big sharp increase in the remote work happening during the pandemic somehow subsides and we return to a little bit more normal life. And we know already from research done from other colleagues, for example, in this slide, we cite the fantastic work done by Marlon Bornez and his colleagues, showing, for example, how certain patterns in the post-COVID-19 society seems to be more common. Like, for example, supercommuting is becoming more common because people that can work remotely more days of the week, they can live sometimes farther away from their job, which means also they can avoid paying very high housing costs in locations like, for example, the San Francisco Bay Area and the Silicon Valley, which are very expensive. Other topics, online shopping and home delivery. Well, already before the pandemic, we knew that there was a rise in e-shopping already before the pandemic. And that trend was continuing because there was a strong preference in Americans to adopt new technologies, despite many of them, they like, for example, in-store grocery shopping. Well, during the pandemic, not surprisingly, there was a sharp increase in shopping for both grocery and non-grocery shopping online. And this was actually, like, interesting because we saw also higher online shopping rates among different groups in the population, including people like elderly or retired individuals, those with disabilities, single workers, and a lot of other people that in the past were not shopping that much online, and now they did it more. So basically what we see is that in the post-COVID-19 society, we tend to have a society in which somehow there is a little bit of a decline from the peak during the pandemic, but still there are longer lasting effects of the COVID-19 pandemic that somehow have accelerated a trend that was already happening. So again, our study tried to look more in depth into these topics. Use of various transportation options. What did the literature tell us? Well, a lot of studies have been focusing on these topics, and we see that already during the COVID-19 pandemic, there were sharp declines, in particular in the use of shared modes of transportation. So, for example, transit, ride-hailing trips decline a lot. But also we saw that the sharper trip rate declines happen in higher income areas and areas where there are more transit commuters and more zero-car households. So those were the areas where there were the sharper trip rate declines. Well, again, other studies have been showing, we compare always our results from our study with other studies. In the post-COVID-19 pandemic, we see that there has been a rebound in a lot of travel. In particular, we see that there's been a rebound in air travel, but still a lot of business travel is below the pre-pandemic levels. We see also that public transit ridership has gained again some traction, but especially in California, remains still below the pre-pandemic levels, in particular for rail system more than bus systems. So again, we try to investigate more into these aspects. And again, access and use of private vehicles. Well, certainly, the pandemic has brought concerns about health risk. And so if people want to use public transport and ride-hailing less, that might mean actually an increased reliance on private vehicle ownership and use. Well, what we have been seeing into the other studies that we can review in the literature, we see that higher income individuals have been increasingly choosing active commuting modes over cars, and this trend seems to have accentuated in fall 2021. We also have seen that the previous transit riders of low-income households, they increased purchase and use of private vehicles due to low used car prices, at least in certain times. The research from Zeng et al. And Manville et al. Has been showing, but also it's a reaction also to the poor transit service in these areas. What do we see today in the post-COVID-19 pandemic? Well, we see that already in 2023, VMT had rebounded at a pre-pandemic level, and it seems to be keeping growing, even if commuter miles are below the pre-pandemic levels, while non-commuter miles are higher. And at the same time, we have seen that the recovery of bus and rail transit had been having different patterns, not returning completely to the pre-pandemic levels, and in particular with rail ridership having a slower recovery trend. Well, low-income community is also very important aspects to analyze, and is very important also for equity considerations. So in our study, we also focus on this. If you look at the studies, the results from previous studies, in the pre-COVID-19, we had the people in low-income areas with limited transit access. They often relied, for example, on shared and mobility on-demand services. And during and those that were encountering more technological barriers, they had to resort to fixed route transit. Well, what happened during the COVID-19? These groups were actually greatly affected by the pandemic. First of all, a lot of them, they could not resort to working remotely because of type of jobs they have. And also we had to see that because of service changes, sometimes transit access issues and health concerns also made that these users that still have to move around and still have to access jobs, sometimes have to use more private vehicles and ride-hailing also for pretty important commuting purposes. The pandemic also caused an increase in vehicle ownership in certain low-income areas, and this was also linked to a lower transit use during the pandemic. So again, in the post-COVID-19 pandemic, other authors already raised the issue that it is crucial that we focus on try to provide better transportation services, in particular to help members of marginalized communities and low-income populations, and in particular considering those that rely on it for daily commutes and they are less likely to work from home. Again, this is more or less what other studies have been doing. And we wanted to build on this for the analysis of our work and to build findings that can help the research community and the policymakers community. And so here comes what we've been doing in our study. So in our study, we've been working with several different ways of surveys that we administer in different times before, during, and after the pandemic. In particular, we have 6 survey waves that we can use for the analysis presented in this project. We have the 2 pre-COVID surveys, the one that happened in 2018 as part of the California Mobility Panel, the one that happened in 2019 with the 8 city surveys in 8 regions of the US. We have collectively between these 2 groups about 7,000 respondents, a little bit more than 7,000 respondents. And for many of them, we have contact information. We can go back to them and we can then re-invite them for future surveys and then also have the ability to compare their answers now compared to the past. So we use this approach with a mixed method of recruitment in which we were always recruiting previous respondents again from the next round of surveys, while at the same time we were also recruiting new participants. So in spring 2020, we had a very large sample of more than 13,000 participants. Of these, about 1,300 were previous respondents from one of the previous waves in 2018, 2019. But then we have a massive new input on new recruitment. In the fall 2020, we started getting a much larger traction in the longitudinal component of the survey. So more than 3,000 respondents are people for which we have at least one data point in the past we can compare, while at the same time we were also recruiting new respondents. In 2021, we also had about 3,000 respondents in the longitudinal component, plus additional respondents that were recruited for that wave. And then in fall 2023, 2 years later, for the post-COVID pandemic, we had about 2,700 new recruitment and new respondents, and a good solid number of 3,700 participants for which we have at least one data point in the past. I want to mention, today we have the time to dive into some of the analysis of this project, but in reality, this data set is providing an enormous source of information that we will be able to continue to analyze. And other researchers that want to analyze this data can contact us, we can collaborate, we can share the data. This is an enormous amount of information that can really help also shape a basis for well-informed policy, for work in the future, and to really help make well-informed decisions. Also, this contract with CARB is ending, but also as part of our work with the National Center for Sustainable Transportation and the US Department of Transportation, we have secured funding for one more round of data collection that will happen in 2025. That means that with our 2-year timeline, 2021, 2023, 2025, we can keep surveying these respondents and get another round of data collection in a time in which we are getting into uncharted territory. The pandemic now is over. Some people say we are back to normal. In reality, we are in a new normal that is different from before the pandemic. And it's very important to continue to study these topics. So while we will work on that related research with new round of data collection in 2025 and new analysis of this data we collected until now from this data set, we will be happy to remain in contact and to share our findings with CARB, with all the other interested agencies, to really try to help make well-informed policy decisions and to support their work with our research. Okay, so let's dive a little bit more. I mentioned before that we have a combination, a mixed method approach to recruit the respondents. So we have some longitudinal respondents, some new recruitment. Let's look a little bit more into the data collection and how we recruit the respondents. And this is a topic that some of us are really passionate. I could spend entire days talking about this. We teach topics like this in the University of UC Davis. We don't have the time to make justice to the topic today, but everybody who is interested in discussing further, please feel free to ask questions in the question and answer, or we can have a follow-up conversation. We love to discuss these topics because the way we collect data affects sometimes the type of results we can find in a study. And so it's very important to consider that. So in this study, we try to use different channels of recruitment to try also to counterbalance the pros and cons of the different methods. So what did we do? We had a longitudinal panel channel. What does it mean? In each wave, we try to recontact previous prior survey takers by email. We send an invitation to them with a link to participate in the online survey. In addition to that, in pretty much every wave on our study, we added new recruited participants that we recruited from an online opinion panel. We work with Qualtrics, the company that manage their own online opinion panel. They work also with some other vendors to recruit their respondents. And so we could recruit respondents from that channel. I want to raise one point about this. I sometimes see some confusion in the research community about this. An online opinion panel doesn't really automatically provide a representative sample of the population. Even if we do our best to replicate mirror the distribution of social demographics in the population, the online opinion panel, by definition, from the fact that we recruit participants from a list pretty much that these companies, these marketing companies manage, whether it's Qualtrics or Ipsos or others, is still by definition a non-probabilistic based method of data collection. It fits under the method of quota sampling, pretty much a method of convenience sampling. So this is something to consider. We want to generalize the results. Well, to counterbalance some of the pros and cons of these methods of data collection, we try to use other methods. We did some convenience sampling, also working in collaboration with certain community-based organizations. This was a way to send out invitations in certain social groups. We work with a community-based organization in particular because we wanted to have more respondents that are members of those communities that sometimes are difficult to reach and are underrepresented in typical surveys. That means also that if you reach them only with an online survey, some people might not be able to fill in the survey with an online tool, or with a computer or a smartphone or a tablet and so on. So what did we do? We were also printing questionnaires that we mail to our community-based organization, and they mail it back. And we had to input the data with some assistance from in our team. We had also some undergrad students that we were employing as part of the project. They would work actually inputting the data in our online data set, and so we could use actually the mail back surveys as part of the study. But also we did something rather unique. If you look in the picture of the COVID-based studies, we did a true stratified random sampling of the California population. So what we do here, we selected a number of randomly selected households in the California population, and we sent to some of them an invitation that included a link to participate in an online survey. So we printed an invitation, it was sent to their mailing address, to their home, and we actually asked a member of the households, even there, to try to have more randomness. We said the member of the household whose birthday was closer to the date they received their invitation to actually, to fill the survey. We also sent to some others, not just an invitation to the online survey, but we sent the full questionnaire. This is a very, very expensive method of data collection. It's also very slow. Until we print the surveys, we send it to the randomly selected households, we mail it to them, they fill it in, they mail it back. The response rates these days are pretty low. That means also that we had to print thousands of questionnaires, and a lot of them end up in the recycling bin, hoping that people are recycling paper, and then only few of them come back with information. So again, the response rates may be low, the cost per respondent is higher, but the paper surveys out of the stratified random sample can be very useful. Why? Because it allows also to compare respondents. Because a lot of studies I see today in the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, they tend to overestimate the ability that people do remote work or hybrid work, of course, because even if they mirror the randomness of the population in the distribution of the population by social demographics, if somebody does a survey online, it's probably more likely that that person is also able to work remotely, or at least in a hybrid way. Well, the randomly selected households that received the paper questionnaire were able actually also to anchor the results and to compare them to what the segments of the population that are less likely to be online and less likely to work remotely, what they were doing during the pandemic. And so that is actually very interesting. And I think, honestly, in full honesty, we haven't really yet assessed all the differences between these channels and all the learning, also because some of these characteristics are unique to this study and they're not present in other studies that we've seen around the country about travel behavior and choices during the pandemic. Okay. So let's look a little bit, we focus here in this slide about the information for the 2023 data set. We have information in the report on all the data sets, so please look at the full report for all the information about all the different data sets, but just focusing on the most recent data set, the 2023 data set. In the 2023 data set, we have 6,462 cases we could use for our analysis. And we see the distribution for the various channels among these 5 channels that were distributed in different ways. And so we have 3,700 that are longitudinal panel respondents, for which we have already data from previous years. We have about 2,000 respondents that we selected at this round from an opinion panel channel. And then we have about 1,000 cases that come from the stratified random sample of the California population, distributed in a little bit a different way among people that received the invitation and then they did the survey online, 636 respondents, 117 respondents from low-income household and marginalized communities that we could recruit from community-based organization, and 256 respondents that mailed back the questionnaire. These 2 groups were groups actually that we could actually receive their paper questionnaires, and we had to enter all the data in our database in our end at UC Davis. Okay, after we receive a lot of data set, after we have a lot of data that comes in, we also had to do a lot of data cleaning. The data cleaning also, the research team was doing data cleaning, identifying respondents, for example, take the survey too quickly. We call them speeders, people that go very quickly for the survey. They clearly don't spend enough time on the online survey. We see the low quality of the respondents. People that have inconsistent reporting in several questions. For example, household composition and work arrangement. In one place, they say that they live alone. In the other place, they say that they actually have 5 household members that are traveling to work and so on. Well, this is clearly inconsistent. So we also identify extreme values in some responses, like, for example, working from a lot of hours or doing too many things, traveling 5 times per day by Uber, 5 times per day by train, 5 times a day by airplane, and whatever else. I'm giving some exaggerations, but this is to identify that there is somehow like, a blurry space there. Some cases are pretty wrong and clearly inconsistent. Some cases are pretty acceptable. And in the middle, there is a gray area where some judgment call needs to be done to review the problematic information. And sometimes some crucially bad responses were removed from the sample. So more or less 10% of the sample in 2023 was removed because we had the bad responses. Sorry, actually, we had about 5% of the sample that were very bad cases that were removed entirely. And we had about 5 to 10% there have some responses there to some variables that were questionable, but some other variables were okay. So we actually include them for certain analyses yet, but not from others. So somehow we have this intermediate call to make about the quality of the responses. And then we had to do some few recodes, for example, of certain variables, like for example, race. We offer another option, and sometimes people report options that are already present in some of the other options. We had to do some data inputting process, and that takes time, but also is very important for the following analysis. Okay, let's go a little bit next. Another topic that's very important to talk is about weighting. Every time we work with data, there is a big question. Well, is your data representative of the population? And of course, I want also to reduce the emphasis of that question because as the literature show, not always we need to have a representative sample. So representative sample, just to remind everybody, is very important, in particular when we look at descriptive statistics to see trends in societies and so on. Then it's important to weight the data set to reduce the departure from the representativeness. But when we do modeling, and we account for the impacts of certain variables, sometimes weighting is less important, and there is also no need at all. Actually, weighting can explode sometimes, the error in the model and so on. So actually, the potential impact of outliers can become bigger. So in some cases, we don't want to do weighting. Anyway, we prepare survey weight in this study using targets for our weights that were available from major sources. So we use the typical targets for weighting process, including variables like social demographics, age, gender, race, ethnicity, education, household income, employment. And it's easy to find targets for this. But also we wanted to look at something more. Clearly, every study that we see in the COVID-19 pandemic seems to have sometimes some issues seems to have some issues in the fact that the higher reliance on online surveys might actually overestimate the prevalence of online activities. And so to do this, we all actually wanted to use some information, and we used the National Household Travel Survey as a source for this, to see not only how many people were teleworking during the pandemic, but also we wanted to look at information about how many people were working before the pandemic. Because sometimes I've seen studies that greatly overestimate the impact of the pandemic on remote work for the simple fact that they tend to include a lot of respondents that, because it's an online survey, already before the pandemic were working remotely more often than other people, than the average American population. And so we use the data from before the pandemic, from the 2017 NHTS data, to actually weight this and to account for correcting for the ability of people to work remotely already before the pandemic. A little bit of information about the weighting procedure. I don't know if we have time. Probably we should go fast about this, but it's important to see in a number of aspects here. I think the next slide provided the full information about the weighting process. Basically, in a nutshell, we have a combination of cell weights and the iterative the ITF procedure from for weighting. That is basically like, you know, an exact weight method with the cell weights, and the ITF we do like, you know, an iterative process for fitting the data that are standard these days for weighting processes in datasets. And so this is like, you know, the full procedure that we use. We have used an iterative process with several different steps, and we were weighting the data, and we were looking at this iteration whether the weights were more or less stable or not. And if they're not stable, we would keep iterating the process until we will get rather stable weights. We also use information from the literature about try to avoid extremely large weights. Why? Extreme weights make some of the data in the dataset have a huge impact. Imagine, for example, that somebody did a very unusual thing on one day. If that person in the dataset has a very large weight, well, that could be extrapolated in a way in which we imply that a large portion of the population does that thing. Clearly, that is not true, but it's just the potential issue that we explode somehow, issues associated with sampling errors, with the fact that we just sample some people one day and another day we sample somebody else with extreme weights. So there are guidelines in the scientific literature to trim extreme weights and then make actually final weights that are actually more balanced and allow for better conservative results. Okay. I talk a lot about the data set. Again, I see some questions in the question and answer feature in Zoom. Please ask your questions. We can come back to you also to answer some of these questions later on. Happy to have a conversation more about these topics. We're passionate about that. But probably today we are here mainly to talk about the results from the study. And I will try to jump across the different topics that I mentioned in the remaining time, starting from the impact of the pandemic on remote and hybrid work. So the big questions here that we wanted to analyze was how did the share of commuters, remote and hybrid work vary during the pandemic and after the pandemic? But also the big question is how much does the remote and hybrid work culture persist eventually in the post-pandemic society? And so we did elaborate further in exploring like, you know, the post-pandemic work arrangements to see also like, you know, what the work arrangement look like in the post-pandemic in California. How do these patterns vary by occupation, and how many workers also work from multiple locations in the same day? Because that is very important. We see today more fragmentation of activities, and some people might travel not anymore in a simple way. I go to the office and come back, but I go to the Starbucks, I work in the cafe, and then from the cafe I go to the workplace, and then from the workplace I go to meet some other people in a very complex patterns of information. We use data from different time periods for this analysis, and we carve out a little bit of results. So here we see like, you know,
Giovanni, sorry, before you move on to results, there were a few questions. So from Connor Voss, sorry if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly. It says, what are some considerations you take when evaluating the relative size of individual weights to determine if a given weight is too large?
Oh, excellent point. I can point you to a couple of publications from actually giants in the field. In the statistics and economics, there have been quite a bit of literature on these topics. The idea basically is that we compare the weight to the variance for the weight distribution, and there is a certain level that is recommended over which we should trim. And when we trim the weights, what happens is basically that portion of the weights, you know, the cumulative weights in the end they need to represent the entire population, gets redistributed on all the other cases in the sample. So there are different guidelines. I think actually somebody in my team can remind me now of the numbers exactly. I think a common guideline is something like 4 to 6 times the interquartile for the weights in the sample, I believe. But anyway, we can point you to by email to the right publication about this, and we can give you the more details about that. I heard somebody chiming in. It was somebody in our team.
Yeah, sorry, Giovanni, that was me.
Oh, Siddharth, yeah.
Basically, yeah, the standard we used was 6 times the interquartile range of the weights multiplied, beyond the third quartile as the cutoff for what's an extremely large wave.
Thank you. Thank you, Patrick.
There was also someone who had their hand raised. I think they lowered it. If you can raise it again, then I can unmute you. Okay. I think you can unmute now. Go ahead and ask your question. Go ahead and unmute and ask your question. Philip, you're unmuted. You can go ahead and ask your question.
Maybe if the microphone of the participant is not working, they can type the question.
Yeah, go ahead and type your question and then we can try to answer it.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah, we can.
Okay, so I work as a transportation engineer in the advanced planning department at District 4 in Caltrans, and we are tasked with a very difficult task of forecasting traffic for future and plan the highway facilities to accommodate the travel demand for next 25 to 50 years in future. And a pandemic of this magnitude, of course, has shifted the travel pattern. Like myself, we are allowed to telecommute 3 days per week, and 2 days out of 2 days, everybody has to be in the building on Tuesday. So Tuesday, what happens is like it's almost not quite as bad as pre-pandemic, but we are getting there. A lot of my friends and their friends who work in IT, they commute 3 to 4 days, which was usually normal in pre-pandemic because IT guys were telecommuting on Fridays anyway, most of the IT guys. So my question is, if we and so what's happening, the new traffic counts are low, and we end up planning our facilities for future 20 to 50 years in future, and I'm afraid that we might underestimate and underplan these facilities, not taking into account that maybe this new norm will become uh, like it's a temporary new norm rather, not a permanent new norm. And there is also political push. I see that a lot of downtown businesses are suffering so much that they have politically affected decisions of state politicians to mandate this travel. So my question is, this temporary behavior may not last too long. What do you think? Because I need to make a case whenever we have these traffic counts and we ask them to just use traffic counts pre-pandemic level so that we don't underplan our facilities for future. I'll mute myself.
Thank you so much, Philip. It's an excellent question, and I think it's difficult to have the right answer for the long-term equilibrium where the new world is going, and probably a lot of factors will affect it, and also will depend on how the way the society will further evolve after this. What we see now in the post-pandemic, and we will talk a little bit more about this in the next few slides, is certainly that there is much more acceptance these days of some forms of hybrid work. What you describe in your agency, the anchor day on a Tuesday, seems to be very common in many organizations. Some organizations, they have Tuesday and Thursday anchor day. That day, there are a lot of people in the office, more interactions. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, much fewer people. Some other places, they tend to have more in-person work in the middle of the week, as Monday, Friday, more remote work. So in general, if you look at the number of commuting episodes, clearly the commuting number of total commuting is below the numbers that were from before the pandemic. Now, there are a couple of things to consider. First of all is that that doesn't mean that when people work remotely, they don't commute at all. We see that people can do a lot of other non-commuting trips, and that contributes to other different patterns, including trips that are more difficult to capture with public transit, because at least in the American society, usually public transport is really shaped in a way that largely serve commuting corridors during the peak time in a better way for people that travel for commuting purposes. So the shift to more flexible days actually has damaged transit more because it has more difficult to intercept those passengers when they need to go out of the peak time on other routes for other non-commuting trips and so on. The other thing that is very important to consider, and we have a side project that we actually been doing, analyzing also passively collected data, and one of our team members, Dr. Siddharth Gulare, is actually been leading that work. We've been looking actually at the connections of between the adoption of remote and hybrid work and the different type of jobs in the different parts of California. Because of course, it's very different, seeing, the type of commuters. Some of them are much more likely to work remotely or in a hybrid way, the stereotype of the workers in the Silicon Valley, but these are not the only ones. A lot of government workers these days are working a hybrid schedule or entirely remote. I mean, many of the state agencies in Sacramento, many of the colleagues in planning agencies, they're doing a lot of work remotely these days, and their offices are pretty empty. While in other sectors, the prevalence of remote work and hybrid work is much lower. I mean, we see that a lot of things are still adjusting. That's the reason we will continue to study these topics. We have data in this project, for example, until 2023. We're planning this new round of data collection in 2025. We will invite you, Philip, and other colleagues to be engaged in our work in the future, also for future presentation events. We are planning an in-person event at UC Davis in November. Everybody here in this crowd attending today is welcome to join us on November 12th for our in-person event at UC Davis, in which we will discuss also these topics. So it's a research workshop with big policy implication. And I think there is a lot to study still, because clearly, the jury is still out and a lot of things are still adjusting. I mean, we see this in the commuting trips. Right now, we can see the commuting numbers, in particular, the AM peak are below the pre-pandemic level. During the rest of the day, everything seems to have shifted a little bit later, more midday trips, more afternoon trips. But we see also this continuously evolving. And we see this also in the airline travel, for example. The airline travel was completely depressed during the pandemic. We saw a resurgence of travel after the pandemic, which was mainly driven by leisure travel. Business travel is still low now. But now we see now in 2024 that something is happening. The demand for leisure trip is actually softening. Many airlines are reporting booking and prices that are below expectation in summer 2024 compared to the big spike they were expecting still to have. So after a very strong 2023, now they see softening of demand for leisure trips. But on the other hand, business trips that were still very low, they're starting to pick up again. So we see still these things still adjusting. So I think probably we might have, and many colleagues has been suggesting this kind of a long-term evolution in which these things will keep tending a little bit to converge to something that is different to what we have today, a little bit more in presence, more in-person trips, more commuting trips and so on, but still right now below the pre-pandemic levels. And of course, I don't want to be in the shoes of those that need to plan infrastructure for the next 30, 40 years, because clearly it's very difficult to make those judgment calls because clearly, it's a very quickly evolving nature of the problem, which is very different from what the situation was before the pandemic, where actually, the future looked more predictable, and it was mainly associated with social demographics and income projections. So we make economic forecasts for the future. We can predict how many people will travel for work and so on. Now everything is becoming a little bit more fluid.
Yeah, I think we should move on to the results, and then we can come back to questions after the presentation.
Yeah, I was gonna say that, Nassim. I'm a little bit concerned about the time for the webinar, but I will try to be fast in the next few slides so we can leave this time for the question and answer. So let me jump into this is really relevant to the topic we were discussing. In our study for each wave of data collection, we were looking at how to distinguish between people that are commuters, people that are remote workers, people that are hybrid workers, and people that really very rarely travel. Like, for example, in the people that are excluded from the analysis are people, for example, that are largely retired, but still once a month they do some activity in person, but they travel only once a month, or they work remotely only once a month. So the other three groups that are in color here, the commuters, hybrid workers, and remote workers, are more the focus of the analysis. I also want to mention there are many different ways to slice the data. Like, this is focusing mainly on these categories, but even inside these categories, you see there's a lot of difference between somebody that travel 1 to 2 days a week and people that travel 5 or more days a week. And so other analysis we have been doing now, and we have a set of TRB papers that we are preparing by the end of this week, that by the end of, well, the end of this month, they will be submitted and presented at the Transportation Research Board conference that we are happy to share, and will be presented also in our workshop in November 12th. They focus more in particular about the number of commuting trips, the number of volume of trips, and so on. But let's look a little bit about the evolution of work arrangements during and after the pandemic. And this slide here shows about, like, the evolution of these patterns during the pandemic. So what people were doing before the pandemic, what they were doing in 2021, what the expectations were for 2022 based on 2021 data, but also what they actually ended up doing in 2023, and what their expectations were to keep doing in the future in 2024 and beyond. And pretty much what we see is clearly that the remote work that was a very tiny percentage, very tiny component that was before the pandemic is there, is remaining, but is still way below what it was in 2020, 2021. What is the big elephant in the room now is the hybrid work. Hybrid work seems to be here. There are expectations that it will continue in the future. But again, let's be careful. These are expectations from the workers. The other side of the medal, we should actually check what the employers want to do, because it's very important to see in the negotiation between employers and employees where, like, the evolution of the work arrangement will be, because many times some people might have certain expectations or certain desire to keep doing what they're doing now, but then maybe there is a call to come back every day in the office or more days in the office from the employers. So we see this evolution, but if you can see something now, we see the prevalence of hybrid work, and this is something probably that is here to stay. Now, we cut slides for more for reasons of time. But one thing I want to point also that what we see here, if we start dividing by urban areas, by rural areas, or we start dividing by low, high, medium income categories, the results really show a pattern in which this behavior with people that tend to work in a hybrid way and keep to doing that more and more in the future, they expect to be more hybrid, is in particular a higher income behavior among people that live more in urban areas and among people that have jobs that are conducive to work remotely. Government jobs, high-tech industry jobs, management jobs, professional jobs, and so on. And of course, like, a lot of jobs that are sometimes manufacturing, agriculture, in other areas, like in retail too, they actually tend to have more in-person presence. So here would be in the blue column of the people that need to commute to work every day, pretty much. Let me go a little bit more, because in this study, what we wanted also to see was to see also how people arrange the time. I mean, many studies during the pandemic have been showing, yes, sure, there is more hybrid work with people mixing things. But a big key question that we wanted to do was, what does it mean to be a hybrid? Does it mean that people on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, they work remotely, and Tuesday, Thursday, they go in the office because it's the anchor day? Or does it mean that the people wake up in the morning, work from home while drinking a coffee, they do some emails, they do some work from home, and then later they still go to the work office, maybe after the peak time to avoid traffic, but they go every day, because the impact on traffic are very different. So to do that, in this study, we developed a method, for example, in the 2023 survey, to really collect detailed information about how people allocate time in the same day, and to see, like, the distribution. For example, this is an example of somebody that work in the they leave home in the morning, they go to a cafe, they work a couple of hours in the cafe, then they go to the office, then they go back to home and work in the afternoon from home. So we could track actually this time allocation to see how people distributed their time. And we started looking at the differences in these things based on the type of jobs, based on the location where they live, and seeing, like, the different patterns in this. I want to call the attention also that it's very interesting to see how, for example, the different work episodes evolve with people that might spend actually time working at home, then they have a break, they go for lunch somewhere else, they go back home and they work again from home. Or some people might have multiple episodes working from home and then going to the primary location, or working at the primary location, going to temporary location, come back to the primary work, and so on. Some key findings from this analysis. It's very interesting that it's only 16.5% of workers that work more than one workplace in the same week at least once, but it's only 16.5%, but actually it's a large number already. And some of this type of behavior is actually very common and more common in people that work in certain areas. So for example, we see that the 8.4% of work days in the sample, they had more than one episode working in different location, and jobs that are in certain areas like community social services, construction workers, they move people in different locations, different episodes. So this is very important to consider because we are looking into this to see, for example, the different impacts for people that split their work week in different work days at different locations versus people that have mixing multiple workplaces in a given day. Our data right now seem to show that the last pattern seems to be limited effect, but non-trivial. And again, at the margin, they might still affect for some important portion of VMT when we explain, like, the behavior of people. I'm trying to go fast because we only have 30 minutes remaining in this webinar. I will touch the second topic. The second topic is the impacts of the pandemic on e-shopping and home delivery. Well, here the questions are how the pandemic affected the e-shopping behaviors during and after the pandemic, but also how these things change across different social demographic groups in terms of their adoption and frequency of e-shopping. And we do this again with different time data, some periods and different data in the analysis. And we look in for example, and looking the different frequency categories, how often people shop online or in person. And we converted it to certain scales to analyze the changes from the pre-pandemic, during the pandemic, and after the pandemic. I will now kind of divide the findings I present between e-shopping for online grocery and e-shopping for online non-grocery shopping. So the traditional e-shopping of people that buy books or something else from Amazon, for example. So let's focus first on online grocery shopping. When we see the online grocery shopping, there is one pattern that is clear. When we look at the evolution, we see that a lot of people starting to shop sometimes online for groceries, and they're keeping doing it also during the pandemic. So this is pretty interesting because somehow, we see the persistence when people starting to get these on-call services, whether it's Instacart, all the different services where you can order grocery, you can order food, we can order meals. When it comes to meals and grocery, a lot of people started doing it during the pandemic, and they're keeping doing it. This is also sometimes responsible for some of the decline that we see in certain shops and restaurants in downtown areas. I mean, we could blame the e-shopping, we could blame the higher cost. There are multiple reasons, but we see a transition in the behavior of individuals, and that's probably something that is accelerating the crisis of retail that was already happening before the pandemic, but also having a big impact, a big dent on our society. When we look at the non-grocery patterns, we see also here, first of all, the numbers are much larger than the one for the grocery shopping. Not a lot of people were shopping online for grocery, and not a lot of people were doing it also after the pandemic. The numbers were larger for people that do it at least sometimes they buy something online, and that is also increased, and it seems to be remaining also after the pandemic, even if declining a little bit from the numbers during the peak in the pandemic. Now, let's look at the demographics. Again, I cannot show here very detailed analysis, but I will try to call on some key findings. One of these, younger age people tend to be always among the people that shop more for groceries pre, during, and post-pandemic. And this is continuing. All numbers, all frequencies gone up, but the younger people remain among the most e-shoppers. Higher income people tend to shop online more for groceries pre-pandemic, but this is not true anymore with post-pandemic. We see that the gap has kind of closed. This is very interesting. We see a lot of more deliveries in all neighbors these days, not only in the higher income households. Also, the gap for gender has kind of closed. In the past, the men were among the early adopters, if you look at the literature in our data in the study, but now we see the women actually has caught up a lot with ordering for grocery shopping. higher educational attainment was associated in the past with non-higher online grocery shopping, with less frequently shopping, and this seems to continue also now. This might be also for the need also to economize, to cut down, like, you know, to try to look for more healthy food in certain groups. I don't want to speculate so much, but it's interesting to look into these patterns, and will be interesting to see also the implication for policies that this have. I want to mention also some other findings for the non-grocery shopping. Again, the younger people have been also more likely to shop online before the pandemic. They keep doing also during the pandemic and post-pandemic also for non-grocery shopping. Higher income households tend to have a higher frequency of shopping online during the entire period. And this remains also today. So the higher income, they shop more online for the non-grocery. Women, they were shop online more for non-grocery items more frequently throughout the entire study period. And also those that were having higher educational attainment, they shop online less frequently for non-grocery items in the pre-pandemic and during the pandemic, but seems to be, like, you know, catching up now in the post-pandemic period. I will try to go faster for the next impacts of the pandemic on travel behavior. So some key aspects here, what we wanted to study. We wanted to study the use of the different modes of transportation, but also the attitudes towards using different travel modes. And so we use here different type of time data from different time periods, and also we focus on different segments of the population by different social demographics. So here again, we process data in various ways to catalogize the data for the categories that we have in the data set. And then we kind of computed some data here showing the use of the different modes in the different groups. And then we can find some key findings for commuting trips and for non-commuting trips, with some differences that we see in the different income groups that are quite interesting. So here I will focus first of all on the fact that young adults seem to be among those people that were more likely to travel by car and less likely to use public transit in 2023 compared to 2019. What do I mean? It's not that young adults are using the car less than other groups. The thing is that the evolution from 2019 to 2023 seems to be, like, you know, in particular sharper for these young adults. Similarly, when we compare the 2023 data for the 2019, we see now that, like, you know, seniors tend to be having, like, you know, a return to public transit, at least, like, you know, using public transit. This is more an analysis of do they use it or not, rather than the frequency. Frequency tends to be down for a lot of users simply because in a lot of times they don't travel to work as much as they were doing in the past. People that were identifying as Hispanic or Black, they seem to be less likely to travel by car and more likely to travel by bus when we compare 2023 to 2019. Again, across categories, those groups are always more likely to travel by bus compared to by car in any year. But when we compare 2023 to 2019, we see that pattern. Similarly, members of lower income households were more likely to use personal bikes, e-bikes, and e-scooters, so an increase in particular for that area, when we see, like, you know, the comparison over time. And the walking was less common now, like, you know, there was this an increase during the pandemic, but when we look at the 2023, somehow the walking seems to be subsided and going down again in the post-pandemic patterns, probably also because of longer distance in the trips that people make. Also, the changes in the attitudes. We see a return now to public transport somehow, and we see that people tend to have more positive attitudes towards walking, driving, car ownership, and also the people that like the idea of public transit has somehow increased, even if it doesn't remain, it remains not very high. In general, like, you know, I think it's important to say though that the distribution of the responses to attitudinal question remains fairly constant across the different survey ways when we look, like, you know, during and after the pandemic. So somehow, like, you know, people that were having certain ideas, they might go a little bit down or more or up in terms of their attitudes, but they didn't change completely their mind from that point of view because of the pandemic. I apologize, I'm trying to go a little bit fast, but I want to catch up a little bit of time for the question and answer. I want to touch the topic of the impacts on access and use of private vehicles. So here the questions was, what factors are impacting the changes in house of vehicle count during and after the pandemic, and what insights we can drive from this for the future? So first of all, if you look at data, clearly the pandemic was, like, you know, disrupting the market in so many ways. The total vehicle sales were dropping during the pandemic. They were rebounding after that. They were slowing down again, gradually recovering after that. And this was also associated with a lot of other changes that were happening. There was a time during the pandemic in which there was a shortage of vehicles, then there was an increase in prices, then there was a decrease in prices. So there were a lot of other things that were changing that affected these patterns. So in this study here, we wanted to see how the change in vehicle count happened during the pandemic. So we look at the past change from the beginning of the pandemic until fall 2023, but also expectations for the future, which is also very important. Are people planning to increase the number of vehicles in the future? Where we see actually some not very nice ideas if we want to have more sustainable mobility, less car dependence, because we see actually that several people tend to actually report now that in the future expected changes, they will increase actually the number of vehicles in the household. So in general, replacing vehicles is more common than others sharing a vehicle, and a larger share of respondents expect to increase or replace a vehicle in the future than they did in the past. So that might point actually to a scenario of more cars on the road, which is actually something that is very concerning when we think about trying to solve mobility problems in California. Now, in our modeling framework, one of our studies that we did develop a model to really study which factors affect the past changes moving from 2020 to 2023, and also the future expected changes in the next 3 years. And we did this controlling in the model for several different variables that we can control. So we developed what we call an integrated choice and latent variable model. For those people that are into modeling, we have a full paper we can share with you with all the details about this work. But the key ideas are that this model combines a few different models. A measurement model component basically analyzes what are the latent constructs that are behind the decision for related to vehicle ownership during and after the pandemic. A structural model that measures who are more likely to have certain attitudes during and after the pandemic, and then a choice model that really analyzes which factors and which of these latent constructs affect the decision of whether to change vehicle ownership or not during and after the pandemic. So again, let me summarize some of the results. We have a full paper on this we can share with you, but some key findings. When we look at the results, not surprisingly, people that tend to be more pro-driving and novelty-seeking, they seem to be more likely to consider increasing their vehicles in the future. Well, that is consistent with expectation. I would also say it's consistent with the findings from before the pandemic. So from this point of view, the pandemic didn't change the world that much. And other aspects, younger generation are more likely sometimes to be willing and be interested in increasing vehicle count, especially when this is associated with the dynamic household composition, changing financial conditions, changes in student work status. So people that climb the income ladder, they change the life cycle. That is a big explanator for vehicle ownership. In terms of work status, here there are some interesting things. Those who expect the transition to be employed in the near future are also expected to increase their mobility needs and buy more cars. This is very interesting. Sometimes the reverse order happens. Some people think, oh, somebody get a new job, they buy a new car. Well, sometimes actually people buy the new car before the change because they are actually already having the perception and the expectation to transition in the new world. My favorite example of this, we had a colleague that actually was finishing his PhD, transitioning to work in the private sector. Right before starting the new job, the first thing he did was buying a BMW. Again, some people will say, wow, buying a BMW causes they got a new job. Well, no, clearly the direction of causality was the other one. The expectation that we're going into the new job and getting a higher paying job after being a student pushed them to buy a fancier car. Another example, in terms of work arrangement, it comes here. In terms of work arrangement, commuting is positively associated with a lower likelihood of shedding vehicles during the pandemic and a higher likelihood of purchasing replacing vehicles in the future. We do not observe a significant impact of remote work on the changes in vehicle counts, but we do see that commuting is associated. That is also straightforward. So a more return to in-person commute might push for more need for cars and more cars on the road. That's very important because this actually might fight against the interest in trying to reduce the car dependence of society. To evaluate this, we did use the method of the average true-term effect. Pretty much is a method to quantify the impact of specific variables of interest on the outcome variable. And so we wanted to see, for example, if people were shifting from one type of commuting frequency to another one, what would happen? And here we can see the average treatment effect with the major policy goal, very interesting things, because when we see that people reduce their current commute frequency, or they go to non-commuting at all, not only there is an impact on VMT, but there is a longer-term impact in which the transition to this higher status of hybrid work or remote work with less physical commuting is actually associated with a reduction in the likelihood to increase vehicle ownership and an increase in the likelihood to decrease vehicle ownership. This is very interesting finding. I think, I hope this short summary of these findings is not too confusing for the people in the audience, but I think this is a big important policy consideration associated with these findings. I will briefly mention the last topic that we wanted to cover today, and then I hope we have enough time for question and answer. And these are related to the unique challenges and adjustments of low-income households during the pandemic. So here the question again was, we think a lot of times about people that can work remotely, they can have a hybrid work, but really when we start looking at members of low-income workers, members of marginalized communities, a lot of these people, they cannot do these transitions. And in this time, recovering from the pandemic, these members of low-income households and marginalized communities, they also have been affected by higher housing costs, inflation rates. So a lot of things that also have affected their living conditions. And so we have been studying this in this project in collaboration also with some other projects at UC Davis. We have been having a full field of qualitative research focusing in particular about low-income households and individuals that they belong to marginalized communities. But something that I want to call the attention here is that when we look at the distribution, there are different nature of jobs and perception of technology that affect people in different groups. In particular, people that are belonging in low-income households, very often they have jobs that do not allow to work remotely. They also have household situation that making the work from home is not practical. They also tend to be sometimes less prone to try the new technology. And these are all things that we need to consider when we do about policy, about adoption of technology, about catering to the needs of the various groups in the population and so on. I also want to call the attention here that the different attitudes towards travel modes. So sometimes we see more respondents in the low-income households that have practical views on cars. They need cars because they need to move from one place to the other one. But at the same time, this is interesting because this is not associated necessarily with a desire to increase, for example, the price of gasoline to provide alternatives, probably also because of the bigger impacts that the cost of gasoline and the price of traveling has on the budget of low-income workers and low-income households. Also, we need to remember the economic hardship brought by the pandemic and everything that happened after the pandemic. We live in times of disruption. We live in times of high inflation, high cost of living in California. This has brought actually economic hardship that is felt much more by the members of lower income groups compared to the rest of the population. And this also translates very often in the fact that members of these groups tend to be less satisfied with their current living conditions and with their life. And then somehow these are somehow correlated with each other, and it's something important to consider when we focus on these groups. I will try to wrap up here, and I hope we can leave at least 10 minutes at the end to have a discussion about key messages and and the question and answer at the end. So the key messages here, I don't need to repeat myself. I think we discussed quite a bit, but pretty much we see that in the post-pandemic, we see a lot of hybrid work that has taken the role that remote work was having during the pandemic. That makes us seem to remain in the post-pandemic society. It will be very important to continue to study and to see how also that translates in trips based on the different number of episodes with people that go to work in certain days, in other days work from home, or sometimes they mix in the same day. And they, for example, they delay their commuting trips, and then instead of going by public transport, they use the car because at that time there is less congestion if they commute midday. The impact on e-shopping is very important. We should consider this also in our policy making. It seems that the shopping to some extent is also remaining in our society. People have become also traditional segments that were not shopping online during the last few years and become more familiar with that, and they keep doing it, even if a little bit less than during the pandemic. And this is very important also for policy making about, like, you know, policies for the distribution of urban deliveries in cities, for electrifying these, potentially try to shift them to modes of transportation that are more sustainable. Cargo bikes could have a big role. They're already having a big role in Europe, in New York, in Portland, in several places. Maybe there is a bigger space also in California for that. And we need to consider also how to understand and adapt to shifts in consumer behaviors towards e-shopping when making policies, and how to shape, like, you know, the policy also for curbside access, urban deliveries, and so on, as it is already in the mind of many planners and policymakers. Transit and active modes. So we clearly see that transit has been, like, you know, hit very hard during the pandemic. There has been recovery after that, but the recovery is slower than what has been happening with car travel. And that has been actually raising issues for the potential impacts on Fairbox revenues and the risk of potentially the death spiral, as some of the colleagues in the planning that we've been talking to, in which low ridership might result in survey cuts that bring also lower ridership. And so we need to consider also how to use, for example, the available funds to provide more frequent service, higher quality service on certain routes, to complement, for example, with technology and on-demand solutions, as is already done by many agencies these days, to complement service in low demand areas to provide better service. But also we see, like, you know, the cycling and pedestrian walk, pedestrian activity has gone up during the pandemic. There has been a potential there to harvest on these, and that can also help to capitalize on this, to try to connect better, to provide first last mile access to public transit and so on. I also want to mention that we see a resurgence of car travel in the post-pandemic society across different groups, whether this is associated with the fact that people need more flexibility with travel, the fact they've been used to avoiding, like, you know, shared modes of transportation, but also the fact that several people, like members of low-income groups, they need cars to move around. And we see that certain groups in particular are increasing, like, you know, their car ownership. They've seen clear patterns that this could also continue in the future. So we will need to develop policies to try to also fight this car dependence and potentially impact on VMT that are also associated somehow to the choice about where somebody works, whether they work remotely or whether they go in person commuting to their office. And then I mentioned already several different challenges affecting low-income workers that they face, from the point of view that, first of all, the remote hybrid work hype that has happened a lot in these years has been less relevant for low-income workers. A lot of them, they have jobs that cannot be worked remotely, so they need to report in person for their duties. It's also important to continue to study these aspects, also in particular to how to, like, you know, to study solutions for the work arrangements and the possibility to provide good mobility solutions for them, but also how to think about the quality of public transit in areas where many low-income workers and households live, and how also, like, you know, to provide, like, you know, transportation that is sustainable and equitable to jobs, training, and other essential services that are needed for all the members of the different groups in the population. I hope I was fast enough to catch up a little bit and leave some time. I think we have still 8 minutes in our webinar. I want to just acknowledge now, I acknowledged at the beginning, the project team and all the great colleagues in our team at UC Davis and the colleagues in the agency that were working with us. I want to acknowledge now the primary funding agencies. We have received tremendous support from CARB under this project that Nassim mentioned today, but also additional funding for various site analysis and various components of this data collection were actually provided by Caltrans, by the SB1 program of the state of California, by SCAG for some more in-depth analysis in Southern California, and by the National Center for Sustainable Transportation that receives funding from the federal government for the US DOT University Transportation Center. And we want to thank all our sponsors. We couldn't do this research without them, and we hope they find our results useful to inform their policy, and we are always here. Our doors are open to answer any question. Feel free to contact us. You're also invited to come to UC Davis on November 12th for our event. We will discuss more this topic. We'll discuss more all the other findings that we have from this project that we could not condense in a 1.5 hour webinar. We could only select selected topics for this project. With that, I will pause. We have several publications for the project, many more to come. The slides will be distributed, I think. So here's a list of publications that are available already. Some others will come soon. If you have any questions, please send an email to gcircella@ucdavis.edu or contact Nassim at CARB, and she can redirect the questions to us, or contact any of the members of our team. We'll be happy to discuss more with you. And also we have included here some references to other studies that we have cited in this presentation. So those of you that want to investigate more from some of the other findings of interest, you can find the references here. With that, I will pause, and I hope we can take some question and answer here, and I will stop sharing.
Great. Thank you so much, Giovanni. Really appreciate that presentation. We do have several questions. One is from Jim McMahon. The question is, did you observe any seasonal effects? Do hot weather or storms or wildfire smoke impact travel behaviors?
Sorry, what was the question?
Did you observe any seasonal effects? Do hot weather or storms or wildfire smoke impact travel behaviors?
Very interesting topic. Difficult to study with this data. This study is mainly largely based on analysis of survey data that are collected certain times during the year, and the self-reported information from the respondents. In the other study that complements this work, so the work that has been led in particular by Siddhartha Gular, we have been focusing on analyzing passively collected data, and so we could actually track there the seasonal effects to a better extent, including also the impacts of vacation, holidays, other events. I'm not sure to what extent we could account wildfires and natural disasters, but certainly we could account for seasonal variability, including differences from year to year, because also as the way the society has evolved, we've seen also the changes from one year to the other one have been changing in the way travel demand varies in the months of June, July, August, when people go on vacation, or in during the Thanksgiving time or Christmas and so on.
Okay, great. Next question is from Zach. The question is, I have seen conflicting research on the net effects of remote work on VMT after accounting for non-work trips, reduced transit mode share, and suburbanization, moving farther from workplaces for hybrid workers. Are you able to provide evidence for the net effects, including indirect, if any, in the new study?
Yes, not included in this presentation here today, but we have a full paper on that topic. The study is actually accounting for the indirect impact of aspects like self-selection of respondents, or the fact of accounting for social demographic characteristics. Because if you look at face value, sure, people that work remotely, they have certain patterns, but also people that work remotely tend to be more likely to be high income, and people that are high income tend to travel more in general. So we could actually wrongly assign the effect to remote work, for example. So to do that, we've been using a modeling approach. We have a paper that we can share. Is going to be ready by the 31st of July next week, and we are going to present it at the Transportation Research Board Conference. Bashar Osbilen has been leading, together with Summer Jorgensen, our graduate student, that work, and we will have some interesting findings on that we can share. So happy to share that. The second component of the question was related to the relocation of residencies. That is a more complex topic to study. The reason is that we have some insights from this study about that, but the sample size of people that move and the connection between remote work and relocation is more difficult to assess when we have a small group of movers. So we have been actually considering doing a separate side study to assess that in more details, and we plan to do it more in the future.
Okay, next question is there is there control for or tabulation of the data for different regions?
Yes, on demand, meaning like, we have data from the different regions. In this presentation today, as you saw, we didn't really show different patterns by different regions. We didn't go into that, but we could definitely regroup the data for the different regions of California. In everything we did, we tend to use 6 regions of California. So we usually divide the 4 large MPOs in California. San Francisco MTC area, the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, the area in the SACOG region, the Sacramento area Council of Governments, the area in SCAG, the Southern California Association of Governments, and the area in SANDAG, the San Diego Association of Governments. And then we have the Central Valley of California, the 8 counties in the Central San Joaquin Valley, and the rest of California with the relatively low density regions in the coastal area, north of California, and mountain area. So we can tabulate results there. We haven't presented them in the results today in this presentation, but definitely it's there in the data set.
Okay, so final question is the FHA VMT data for California showed 2022 VMT approached pre-pandemic levels until November and December. We've seen consistently lower levels of VMT during those months. Have you explored this dynamic?
So the dynamic of lower VMT during November, December, is that correct?
I think so, yes.
Yeah, that's interesting. So 2022, I don't know right now by heart to explain that. We should look into that. We are not this. So the short answer is no. We have not explored the dynamic behind the lower levels during those 2 months. We could try to study the reasons for that. I mean, in general, the VMT that has been observed as ramp up back already in 2022 quite a bit in California, and that also has come at the expenses of other modes. So we see more commuting trips, more miles for non-commuting trips, lower miles for commuting trips, but also some shift from other modes of transportation, including public transit, to driving. The specifics about those 2 months, which we would need to investigate.
Okay, so unfortunately we've run out of time. If we haven't gotten a chance to answer your question, please feel free to reach out to Giovanni or myself. And I've posted in the chat the link to the 3 final reports, and the presentation slides and the recording will also be available at that same webpage. So again, thank you so much to Dr. Circella and his entire team. We really appreciate all of your work and your time to present this information to all of us.
And I want to give a special thanks to you, Nassim, for organizing this webinar, but also for being a fantastic person leading the work together with Melanie Zauscher in CARB. And it's been a pleasure to work with you on this project. And again, everybody who has questions, they can contact me or contact you, and you can redirect the question to our research team. We are here actually to answer questions. We are here to try to make this research relevant to inform policy, to help colleagues.
Okay, great. So thank you everyone for joining, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you all.